Given the way educational chances are distributed in our society, only a very few men and women, and more men than women, ever get the chance to become full-time intellectuals. Often, these men and women work in schools, colleges, universities, in the academic world, and they tend to confuse the jobs they hold, the careers they are carving out for themselves, the whole restricted universe of academia for serious, critical intellectual work. They equate the restricted route they have been privileged to take to knowledge with the functions of knowledge itself, with its production. Let me insist that the academic and the intellectual are not interchangeable terms. They are not the same thing. They may even be at the opposite ends of the scale. The academic life can actually prevent intellectuals from doing serious intellectual work. The academic world certainly encourages us to cut ourselves off from the transmission of ideas into action, the propagation of knowledge among the people. The fact is that, as Gramsci, the great Italian revolutionary and theorist, once said, all men are intellectuals, though only a few are paid to do such work. All men, insofar as they think about what they do, apply thought to action, become self-conscious of their actions and their consequences, are intellectuals. If, then, we full-time intellectuals restrict our knowledge to those who have been fortunate enough to get full-time education and to work in universities, we are simply reproducing, by our own efforts, the unequal distribution of knowledge and education in our societies. We are simply contributing to the perpetuation of the knowledge of the few and the ignorance of the many. Academics may be satisfied with that role. Revolutionary intellectuals cannot be. Stuart Hall, 1974 London speech in defense of Walter Rodney.
Welcome to Proles Pod.
Hello, and welcome to Proles Pod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlesPod and on TikTok at proles.pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/ProlesPod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. And, as many of you are probably now aware, good news! We will now be doing monthly Vanguard drawings for a Proles pack. This will be a mystery box of sorts, which will include a postcard from us, some random communist pins, a random coffee table or history book, which Tony feels the need to specify is not a coffee table, but a coffee table book or history book. I don't know why he feels that's necessary, I suppose.
I'm signing up at the Vanguard tier. I need a coffee table.
Yeah. And a very limited run merch item that we have designed ourselves. We will announce the monthly winner in an episode, as well as share a cheeky picture of the box on our Patreon. These Proles packs will also be given away as rewards for future contests. We already did one for the Flat Stalin on Instagram. So yeah, keep an eye out for those. This episode is brought to you by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Today, we're going to be providing a foundation for aspiring Marxists and reinforcing the foundation for current Marxists. But first, who do we have with us today?
Hi, it's me, Ray.
And our special guest is Andre, and I am your host, Jeremy. So I guess, Andre, where would you like to begin?
Okay, before I introduce myself, I would like to give a shout out to April and Phil. April introduced me to Proles Pod, and she's been a longtime listener of Proles
Nice.
since very early in the original run.
April, we love you.
Same with my buddy Phil, longtime fan, who also
Phil, we love you.
who also happens to be the world's second biggest Eric Honecker fan. The first one is me.
Oh, okay.
They're both really cool and well-read comrades who I respect a lot. A number of my comrades have actually been influenced by Pearl's Pod over the years.
Nice.
Something I found out only really recently. And I personally wouldn't be the person I am today if it wasn't for you guys. So it's cool to be here. Anyway,
And so like the Eric Honecker fan club, is there like do you have like meetups, or is there a website?
Do you guys give away coffee tables? Or
you can
books?
be an Eric Honecker fan by upholding the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism.
Nice.
And always defending the GDR, of course.
Of course.
Yeah. I'm Andre. I'm a contributor to the YouTube channel, Weeb Revolution. Various people have made videos for the channel over the years, and I'm actually the newest contributor compared to everyone else. I've personally made a few small videos and shorts talking about anime, but most of my recent output has actually been focused on encouraging people to read history and theory, even though it slightly conflicts with the channel's anime theming. But the main connections there between anime and communism comes from critically thinking about the horrible industry standards for animators and show staff that are results of an unorganized labor force, not just in Japan itself, but also in South Korea, where a lot of animation work is outsourced. Side note, next time you watch an anime, keep an eye on the end credits and see if you can spot any contributions from the South Korean studio DR Movie. They are involved in a lot of animation. They're kind of the unsung titans of animation in anime. Back in the 2000s, DR Movie did most of the animation for like 19 episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So they've been around for a long time. But anime is not the main topic of this episode. I'm here because I made a resource guide for aspiring Marxist-Leninists a while back, and I would like to flesh out some of that ideas here on Pearl's Pod.
Nice. So I guess sort of in brief, we were talking about a foundation for Marxists, but maybe it's more for Marxism-Leninism.
Well, first I'd like to talk about the actual structure of this episode and what it is and what its point is.
Sure.
So despite the title, it's not a crash course or primer on anything. The actual primers will be recommended in part 2. If you're listening before part 2 is out, just wait on that. If it's already out, give it a listen. After you finish this one, time is constantly changing. This episode is not the end-all be-all of anything, nor is it intended to be a replacement for reading anything. In fact, after you listen to this episode, take a look at the show notes. I put a lot there for Jeremy, and do some reading ASAP. If it seems like I quote from a lot of varied stuff in this episode, that is partially because I just want to recommend as many books as possible to the listeners. Please read.
Yeah. Important.
Beginners to the Marxist tradition are the intended target, but for the people who have studied for either a modest amount of time or even for a very long time, there's bound to be some good stuff here for you too. So even if we just mostly end up helping decently read people flesh out their reading lists, that's fine too. Read a book. We've got a ton listed in the show notes. Please read. Before I dive in, I'll just very quickly summarize the structure. We're going to focus on 3 main books today and the themes they represent. The first is the Soviet world. The accompanying theme is the Soviet attempt at socialism. The second is discourse on colonialism, which is technically an essay, but I'll call it a book here for the sake of categorization. And its theme, capitalism as a global system. And the third is atrocity fabrication and its consequences, how fake news shapes world order. And its theme is the endless Cold War. Each of these books will be accompanied by 2 thematically relevant follow-ups, albeit with quicker summaries just for the sake of time. Meaning we'll talk about 9 books total this episode.
Sure, that's totally easy.
Yeah. In part 2, which will be a separate episode, because I accidentally wrote 3 hours worth of notes. We'll actually talk about diving and learning theory proper, as well as capping off with tips and advice for studying. Some of you may wonder, hey, why don't you start with theory right away? Well, that's just how the format worked. It's also important to have a balanced comprehension of theory and history, and there's a large overlap between the two. But, it's more than that. This episode is also intended to help deprogram people who are struggling to fight bourgeois narratives of history. And given the international focus of 6 of the 9 books here, it's intended to help guide people to a real anti-imperialist perspective, because capitalism is a global system, and the establishment of socialism will necessitate its victory worldwide. Again, check out the show notes. We will list every single book or essay we talk about here. There will be a lot of direct links, most of them hosted on PearlWiki's library. Specific shout out to one of the co-founders of PearlWiki, Forte, for giving me permission to mention and link their stellar website on this amazing podcast.
Nice.
Now, before we get into the books, let's try to define Marxism-Leninism.
Go for it.
Before we even try to do that, let's talk about communism and socialism. Apologies to the listeners if the way I explain things is not the best, but, well, I'm the only person. So, we want to achieve communism, which is the hypothesized future political and economic system where class divisions have been removed and society is oriented towards meeting human needs. Friedrich Engels, in Principles of Communism, calls it, quote, the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat, end quote. We cannot predict exactly how it will look, but it will involve a society where the means of production are highly advanced, as well as collectively owned by society. This is different from today, where the means of production around most of the world are owned by capitalists. The means of production are, and here I'll be citing volume 1 of the Translated Vietnamese Textbooks Appendix. Again, this will also be in the show notes. Physical inputs and systems used in the production of goods and services, including machinery, factory, buildings, tools, equipments, and anything else used in producing goods and services. This is where so many people who have a surface level understanding of the Communist Manifesto get tripped up. The call in the manifesto is for the abolition of private property. It means to seize property that is used to create profit based off of the labors of others. This means factories and their assorted machinery, giant farms, properties used to rent, etc. This is different from personal property, which tends to be distinguished by its use value. Your clothes, your home, your cell phone, and yes, even your toothbrush. We won't take your toothbrush away, don't worry.
We might.
We might, but... Well, maybe it was one of those fancy ones that play music, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Those are definitely getting collectivized.
Yeah. But in order to get to communism, the world must pass through the long transition stage called socialism. There are various definitions of socialism, and people will use it to mean many different things. Sometimes they'll use it in such a wrong way that my head hurts. But for us, we base it off of scientific socialism. Citing the textbook again, they define scientific socialism as a body of theory and knowledge, which must be constantly tested against reality, focused on the practical pursuit of changing the world to bring about socialism through the leadership of the proletariat. I would now like to quote Maurice Cornforth's second volume of his Intro to Dialectical Materialism. This is a long quote, but I think he does a good job of explaining the origins of Marxism and its significance.
The great contribution of Marxism was to develop scientific socialist theory and to introduce it to the working class movement. Marx and Engels based socialism on a scientific understanding of the laws of development of society and of the class struggle. And so they were able to show how socialism could be won and to arm the working class with knowledge of its historical mission. Marx did not arrive at his conclusions as a pure research worker, though he did conduct profound research. In the 1840s, Marx was engaged as a revolutionary Republican and Democrat in the movement which led up to the revolutionary year 1848, and he arrived at his conclusions as an active politician, striving to understand the movement in which he participated in order to help guide it to the goal of the people's emancipation from oppression, superstition, and exploitation. These conclusions were formulated in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which Marx wrote in collaboration with Friedrich Engels in 1848. They saw the whole social movement as a struggle between classes. They saw the contending classes themselves as products of the economic development of society. They saw politics as the reflection of the economic movement and of the class struggle. They saw that the bourgeois revolution then in progress, the task of which was to remove the vestiges of feudal rule and establish democracy, was preparing the way for the proletarian socialist revolution. And they saw that this revolution could only be consummated by the working class conquering political power.
All right, thank you for reading that, Ray. So I hope the listener sees that Marx and Engels had to engage with the world around them in order to formulate their ideas and theories.
I thought you were going to say, I hope the listeners see that Ray is literate.
Well, you're going to be reading a lot today, so it'll be obvious. But, Marx and Engels, they didn't sit in their offices and just make this stuff up. They grappled with data, research, and worked to refine their ideas. Marx studied capital itself and the economic laws of society, studied how exploitation was essential for capitalism, and through all this discovered the laws between human social development. This is where the term historical materialism comes in. Historical materialism is dialectical materialism applied to the analysis of human history, development, and society, while dialectical materialism is the philosophy and method. But Marx and Engels did not view history in a rigid, deterministic way. They saw that people played an active part in trying to affect change throughout history. And Marx and Engels were not content to merely study society. As Marx said in his thesis on Feuerbach, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Right. Let's elaborate on dialectical materialism just a little more. Here, I'll briefly be citing the introduction to Georges Pulitzer's book, Elementary Principles of Philosophy. We will discuss this specific book along with the Vietnamese textbook and Kornforth's book later in part 2, but I find the introduction here to be so important because of how clear it is for beginners.
Marxism is intimately linked to a philosophy and a method, those of dialectical materialism. It is therefore indispensable to study this philosophy and this method in order to understand Marxism and to refute the arguments of bourgeois theories as much as to undertake an effective political struggle. Indeed, Lenin said, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement," in What is to be Done. This means, first of all, it is necessary to link theory with practice. What is practice? It is the act of realizing. For example, industry, agriculture realize, i.e., put into reality, certain theories, chemical, physical, or biological theories. So what is theory? It is the knowledge of things we want to achieve. We can be practical only, but then we realize by routine. We can be theoretical only, but then what we conceive is often impossible to achieve. So there has to be a connection between theory and practice. The whole question is to know what this theory should be and how it should relate to practice. We think that the militant worker needs a method of analysis and reasoning that is just in order to be able to carry out a just revolutionary action. That he needs a method that is not a dogma giving him ready-made solutions, but a method that takes into account facts and circumstances that are never the same. A method that never separates theory from practice, reasoning from life. Now, this method is contained in the philosophy of dialectical materialism, the basis of Marxism, which we propose to explain.
So basically, like, the true dialectic is fucking around and finding out.
Exactly.
Yes,
right.
yeah.
I'm so glad you got it. But, in this quote, we have the essential connection between theory and practice that you always have to remember. This is why I had us open with the episode with a quote from Stuart Hall, where he attacks bourgeois academics who in their university positions refrain from taking practical action or disseminating knowledge among the masses. It fosters an anti-intellectualism that makes people defend the existing capitalist system. The great Kwame Ture, in a lecture at the University of Georgia in 1979, described a thought experiment. He guessed that if you took a poll of the American population, like 90% of them would say they hate communism. I think today that'd be much lower, actually. But he said he would guess that only like 0.2% of them would be able to offer an intelligent definition, even if it was not necessarily correct, of what communism even was. And one part that really stuck out to me in that lecture of his was where he said, "The man or woman who hates communism the most knows the least about communism."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And the power of knowledge and consciousness is so important, because without it, we would be struggling and flinging ourselves at capitalism without a holistic understanding of what it is, how it developed to its current stage in history, how it may develop in the future, and how the political and social institutions of our world work to uphold it. Without Marxism, our activism and struggle against the system would be blind. How do we defeat an enemy we can't understand? And, touching on the political and organizational side, which the listener will learn about as they study Lenin specifically, how can the proletariat seize power and keep it? This is why, Occupy Wall Street back in like the early 2010s, despite raising a lot of public awareness and overall consciousness and changing the national debate, they couldn't become more than a protest movement. For a list of contemporary examples of similar vanguardist movements not achieving what they wanted, I recommend Vincent Bevan's 2023 book, If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. That was one of the books I recommended.
Which I recommended in the... What theory did I just read? Do I exist?
Was it
Reformer Revolution? I recommended this in the Reformer Revolution. So if you won't listen to me and listen to Andre, thank you.
it's funny too, because this is a critique of some of these sorts of movements, but you know what Micah White is doing now? The guy who was sort of like the central focal point of Occupy Wall Street.
What's he doing?
He's a consultant who now gives like professional guidance for how to
like do an
build
activism.
how to do an activism. It's insane. Like he gets paid, who knows, hundreds of thousands of dollars probably per year to effectively market grassroots movements. It's so crazy.
It sounds like he might actually be helping create color revolutions. That's actually kind of creepy.
He probably is doing that, yeah.
And so if that's not enough of an endorsement, if you refuse, based on both of our recommendations, not to read this book, just know that at the end, when Vincent Bevins goes back and tries to interview some of the people, basically the whole consensus was like, damn, we should have read more Lenin.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah. Book's title again, If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. Again, it'll be in the show notes. Please check out the show notes and read a book.
Cool.
All right. There is one last thing I would like to touch on, and it relates to the general thrust of this episode, and that being the necessity of raising our general understanding of history and the world, our general knowledge, and how we go about doing it. One really unhealthy way to approach studying, and we will get to actual studying habits and tips in part 2, is to be constantly hitting yourself for not knowing enough. Yes, you should strive to know as much as you can in various fields, but you don't have to concern yourself with knowing everything as if the revolution relies on just one person having all the knowledge.
Mhm.
Knowledge is social. I have a quote here again from Maurice Cornforth's Intro to Dialectical Materialism. Again, direct links in the show notes. This one I actually digitized using my phone, the whole thing. So if it's not the easiest thing to read, I'm sorry. That's the technology I had to work with. Be glad that I took like 600 pictures of that book to get it to you guys.
No worries.
Oh, this is from Volume 3, page 150. Of course, knowledge is built up by individuals, just as everything man creates is created by individuals, but it is built up by individuals acting in cooperation, depending on one another, communicating their experiences and their ideas. Many individuals in society can do what none of them individually could possibly do, and one of these things is to build up human knowledge. Every individual acquires a great deal of knowledge from his own experience, but he would not do so apart from his association with others, and if he did not learn from others what they had already learned. The very means for forming and expressing ideas, namely language, without which no ideas would be possible, is a social product and exists only as the common possession of a society. Some individuals make especially great contributions to building up new knowledge, while many make no contribution at all. Yet the former would not have made their contribution if they had not been members of a particular society, if they were not in communication with their fellows, if they had not learned what their society had to teach, if they had not had at their disposal the numerous material and intellectual means for acquiring knowledge which their society had produced. It is, then, only in society that knowledge is required and built up, and its roots lie in the social activities of man. It is built up by the interchange of experiences and ideas between members of society in the course of their various forms of social activity, and it is sifted and tested in the same process. Knowledge is social, people.
Yes.
And it's so important for us to remember when studying and learning that we need to do 2 things. First, interact with comrades from different walks of life, whether they be people from other parts of the world, people of different ethnic groups, people of different sexualities and gender identities, and the people who are differently abled, especially because capitalism despises disabled people and people who cannot commit to the endless grind. Learning from others will make you a better communist. Second, we sometimes need to engage with works written by authors who have an ideological worldview that opposes ours. Because even if their final analysis or conclusions are erroneous, if their research is good, then we can still extract important information from them. Marxist political economy would not exist without the prior contributions of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and one of my favorite contemporary authors, A.B. Abrams, whose book I will recommend twice in this episode, isn't even a Marxist, but his research is so invaluable in understanding modern geopolitics and Western imperialism and militarism. Really, what I'm saying is don't just study in your comfort zone or try to stay in an echo chamber when you study. If Marx did that, he wouldn't have gotten anywhere. And with that preamble out of the way, let's cover our first book, This Soviet World, and its accompanying theme, the Soviet attempt at socialism.
I think it is a very good thing for the masses to know that in carrying out a revolution, that they had not won the heavens when they reached power. What we inherited was really hell. It is very important for the masses to know that well-being is not just around the corner, and that imperialism and capitalism did not leave us a Garden of Eden or paradise. Paradise has to be built with work. That is one of the lessons we have learned. Fidel Castro, 1971.
History does not progress in a straight line. It zigzags, steps back, and turns. The socialist phase of civilization has not managed to avoid these turns. Despite the temporary defeat of socialism in the Soviet Union, the 20th century will go down in history for the destruction of the colonial system, the defeat of fascist tyranny, and the experiment in construction of a socialist society. On the basis of that history, humanity will eventually realize a breakthrough to a socially just society, one in which the individual will come to full fruition. Yegor Ligachev, 1996.
Oh my God, you guys have perfect audiobook voices. and I'm over here just like frantically speaking so fast because I wrote so much. And I know Jeremy has to go to work after. So
I do. It's sad.
All right. So this book is This Soviet World, written by the brilliant Anna Louise Strong.
Friend of the pod.
The GOAT.
Friend of the pod, Strong. Written 1936, or published 1936. So quick background on Strong, although I'm sure longtime listeners of Proles know about her. She was a U.S. journalist who traveled, lived, and wrote extensively about the Soviet Union for U.S. audiences back home. Listeners of the Proles Pod Stalin Era series will be familiar with her and her work, like I said. Many people know her time in the USSR, but she was especially active in pre- and post-revolutionary China, writing extensively about both periods. She met and spoke to Mao Zedong, friend of the pod, many times, and he even made her an honorary Red Guard. Strong also met the Red Prince Suphanaghan, aka the man who became the first president of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. She met Ho Chi Minh, revolutionary leader of Vietnam, and affectionately known as many as Uncle Ho. And she even personally met Kim Il-sung, revolutionary leader of North Korea, in the period of time after the liberation of the North, but before the Korean War. You can read about it in her pamphlet, North Korea, First Eyewitness Report, link in the show notes, of course. Also, this is when Kim Il-sung was like 36 years old. So this was when he was like really, really hot. So jealous about that. Like if you look at pictures of him, he's like
handsome boy.
Oof.
Kim Il-sung thirst traps available at the Patreon.
So The Soviet World was written in 1936, the year of the new Soviet Constitution, but still before the tragedy of the Yazovshchina and the eventual invasion by Nazi Germany. Fascism was gripping the world. The seemingly endless Great Depression was challenging the legitimacy and stability of bourgeois democracy, even in the advanced capitalist countries. And the Soviet Union was offering an alternative model to the world, while it also readied itself for what it knew was another inevitable world war. So I'm just going to very quickly read the table of contents just so the listeners know what to expect and what topics she covers. So there's On Interpreting a World, which is the relatively short intro, just a handful of pages. And for the main chapters, we have The Plan for Remaking the World, The Party of Revolution, The Dictatorship, The Growing Democracy, The Union of Nations, The Technique of Leadership, Building the New Economy, The Struggle for Peace, The Factory Collective, Farming a Continent, The Freeing of Women, Democratization of Science, Democratization of Art, Remaking Human Beings, Youth Set Free, and New Men Emerge. So, one of its pros is that it's easy to read. This is a reference to both its length, since most of the chapters are like 10 to 11 pages, but it's also praise for her writing style. Strong is easy to read because she's a fantastic writer.
Mm-hmm.
She can convey a lot of information in a very digestible way. I think for people who are out of practice with reading, she's a great beginning point because she gets you excited to read again. Like, I can attest to that. She is one of the reasons that I read so much now because I read one of her books and I was like, oh my God, this is magical. I forgot how much I love reading.
It's in that like short introduction that you mentioned. It's such a good intro to this book as well, even though it's very short. And it doesn't even necessarily touch on the specifics. It's not like a traditional introduction where it's like, here's what I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to talk about that thing, and then this other thing. It's like a thematic introduction. And there's a point where she's like, I'm flying back from Moscow and I landed in Berlin. And the first thing I noticed when I like left the airport was a giant billboard that said, "Think of your hair." And she was like, it was such a jarring thing for me to see after coming back from the Soviet Union, where you're not like bombarded with that kind of bullshit, where women are not sort of like expected to like shape themselves for, whatever the men of the world or whatever. I'm not, like, I don't know. It's a very good, I mean, what a writer. I love Anna Louise Strong.
Well, I guess like the title, This Soviet World, it's a different world entirely.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like I covered this book in a book club. I ran with some comrades, and it was the effect was like on them was palpable. I could feel them getting fired up.
Yeah.
Like every chapter we read, they were like, "Oh my god, I am so inspired."
Yeah, yeah.
And another great thing about the book, the introduction to fundamental Marxist-Leninist concepts. First, I would like to quote an excellent part from chapter 1. The Communist Manifesto is usually thought of as a defiance flung at the world by an illegal revolutionary party of hunted people. So it was. But it was also man's first attempt to apply science to the analysis of human society in order to draw up a plan for remaking the world. Previous attempts to analyze the world were exercises of philosophers, not directed towards change. Again, Marx' thesis on Feuerbach. Previous attempts to change the world were confined to threats or exhortations to secure specific conversions or reforms. Blech. Many utopian pictures had existed of how beautiful society might be when once made over. But the Communist Manifesto tried to answer the question, how can the thing be done? Born in the middle years of that century, in which the scientific method was consciously remaking the material world, it sought to analyze the elements of human society, the nature and the cause of changes we see in history, for the purpose of producing social change in a desired direction. That is why it claims to be scientific socialism. So, just in that paragraph, we get a great illustration of how Strong understands the fundamentals of Marxism and how she can convey them to her readers, specifically US Americans who knew likely very little about communism. In the 2 paragraphs after it, she elaborates even further, but I think we can actually jump ahead a little just for the sake of time. So I would like to quote from chapter 2, The Party of Revolution, because there is an excellent summation of what it means to be a communist. There's going to be some jumping around and splicing just for the sake of the episode's flow. I'll read this first part, and then one of you can take over. The most famous picture of the ideal communist is given by Krupskaya, the widow of Lenin, in an article entitled, What a Communist Should Be Like. First of all, a communist is a social person with strongly developed social instincts who desires that all people should be well and happy. Second, they must understand what is happening about them in the world, the mechanism of the existing regime, the history of the growth of human society, the history of economic development, of the growth of property, the divisions of classes, the growth of state forms. They must clearly picture whether society is developing to a regime where the happiness of some will not be based on the slavery of others, and where there will be no compulsion except strongly developed social instincts. And the communists must clear the road as you clear a path in the wilderness to hasten its coming.
Those who would lead the masses in changing the world by the Marxian method must obviously strive for constant growth in 2 directions: in ever-deepening understanding of social and economic forces, and in ever-widening participation in workers' struggles.
Again, back to that connection, theory is a realization in practice.
Perhaps the first thing that strikes an outsider is the amount of time which all communists devote to the study of Marxian theory. Managers of great steel plants and busy county officials, under the pressure of harvest, will find time, at unearthly hours like 11 at night or 7 in the morning, for their study of Marxism, or their class in current events, deeming these things as essential as their other pressing work. Visitors to the Soviet Union are not infrequently amazed to find that a party secretary in a rural township can discuss international affairs with an assurance and abundance of detail which few foreign editors of an American metropolitan newspaper can show, and will handle statistics and history with a good deal more ease than President FDR's quote-unquote brain trust. A prominent American politician once expressed to me doubts of the accuracy of the published interview of H.G. Wells with Stalin. Stalin's references to the Cromwellian Revolution seemed to him too detailed to have been available for conversation. People, he said, don't talk that way. But any communist in the Soviet Union who did not know the essentials of the Cromwellian Revolution and of other historic revolutions from which he is expected to learn would join a class to, quote unquote, raise his ideological level. A communist who allowed himself to become as ignorant of world affairs as is the average American politician would be ruthlessly cleaned out of the party or told to join the group of sympathizers to learn what he has to know.
Again, like we talked about in the preamble, you must add to your knowledge and train your intellect if you wish to be a communist. We can and must all be revolutionary intellectuals, even if we are not academics. I think just with these paragraphs that we've read, we've really clarified the type of work ethic and dedication required to be a communist. This is actually why I label myself as an aspiring Marxist-Leninist. I'm not studied or involved enough in practical struggles to call myself a communist comfortably, not if I'm serious about the historical meaning of that word. But I think having these parts of the Soviet world to read really inspires me to work hard to achieve that level. And I hope that the audience has some sort of fire being lit in them by Strong's words. Now, something super important about the book, just as important as the introductions to these basic concepts of theory and practice, is what Jeremy talks about, the way that Strong directly transport you to the Soviet Union. This book doubles as history. You get to learn from Soviet history and not just from a Western perspective tainted by years of Cold War meta-narratives. You get humanizing portrayals and anecdotes from so many people, although that's a consistent in basically everything that Hannah Louise Strong has written. I particularly love the little story in chapter 9 where her stepdaughter Ducia is involved in a factory collective in the attached university, just because she shares some really very humanizing stories of what Ducia was eager to do and what she did in her free time. You know, the way that Strong shows that people's lives were being positively transformed during this period. It wasn't easy. Many people died tragically in the Russian Civil War, the rural battles for collectivization, the executions and repressions of the late 30s. But the results of millions of people's hard work to organize and change their society was real. This was a complex time period, and to insist it was either perfect, which it was not, or that this period was an aberration of humanity and history, which it was not, is to hold a non-materialist view of the world's first socialist state. Strive for nuance and deeper understanding as we fight to build socialism. And that's what I find so important about this book, and it's why it's the first one we're recommending today. It brings to mind something Kwame Ture said. When you see people call themselves revolutionary, always talking about destroying, 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 but never talking about building and creating, they're not revolutionary. They do not understand the first thing about revolution. It's creating. So I guess I should mention some cons. The book is a good read, but it's not comprehensive. You know, it was written for a US audience to introduce them to another possible way of organizing society and to clear up misunderstandings about the USSR. Further elaborations on certain topics would have been good, but that's the nature of its length. This is why it's the first book, you know. It's good to remember we're setting a foundation for further study. This isn't the end-all be-all of anything.
As always, I can't say enough good things about Anna Louise Strong. This book was very similar in sort of style and tone to I Change Worlds, even though I Change Worlds was mostly like publication of her diaries, which should tell you something about her as a person. If like her writing that was intended to be published sounds very similar to her writing that she never intended to be published, that she was who she was, you know what I mean? But yeah, like the little anecdotes about people's lives, always very touching. That was also the case in I Change Worlds. We mentioned that repeatedly during the Stalin eras. But yeah, please read this book, even if you're not brand new to Marxism, and even if you know everything that there is to know about the USSR. It's a very well-written and enjoyable book to read.
So, we have two follow ups related to this theme of the Soviet attempt at socialism. One is more focused on analyzing the broader politics of anti communism in general, and the other is centered on learning lessons from the country's death. The first follow up is The Russians Are Coming: The Politics of Anti Sovietism by V.L. Allen, published 1987. So I could talk about this book all day, but we still have so much ground to cover. It explores so many great topics within it: criticisms of bourgeois democracy, criticisms of the research methods of so called Sovietologists like Robert Conquest or Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that Gulag Archipelago guy. There's a chapter with debunking charges of anti Semitism lobbed at the USSR, questions about Soviet dissidents, and a whole section of the book devoted to analyzing US society and the political economy of US militarism. But the book is ultimately a Marxist look at the propaganda war against the USSR, and the author does a stellar job examining the social basis in the US for that propaganda war. There are genuine criticisms of the USSR he makes in the book, as he rightly should make, but it's done from a place of intellectual honesty, and I think that's much more valuable than reading whatever trash Robert Conquest wrote about Stalin.
Right.
One big con is the publishing date, 1987. So when he talks about repression in the late 1930s, he doesn't have access to the Soviet archives like you all did during your Stalin era series. So like he holds that Tukhachevsky, the military general, was innocent, and pretty sure we know that Tukhachevsky was actually guilty. And if he had stayed in his position, that might have ended up being very dangerous for Soviet society.
Right.
He also has some unfortunate deference for Soviet leadership, particularly Gorbachev and the leadership in power by 1987. I don't necessarily blame him for being fooled. He couldn't have known how hard Gorbachev would sell out the entire revolution. But, hindsight is 2020.
And I think people, are rightly critical of how Gorbachev handled perestroika and all of his sort of late policies that led to Yeltsin. But I think it is important to remember that Gorbachev did consider himself to be a Marxist-Leninist. He considered himself to be a socialist, and he considered his decisions to be what was good for the Soviet Union. He was just wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. And when Alan quotes him a few times, he does actually sound like a principled communist.
Right.
Yeah.
Hindsight's 2020.
Yeah.
I did also make a YouTube short for Weeb Revolution in mid-September with a quote from this book, so I'll actually leave off this recommendation with that. Now we have the other follow-up to the Soviet world, Socialism Betrayed: Behind the Collapse of the Soviet Union by Roger Caron and Thomas Kenny, published 2004. This is specifically the second English edition. So as it says in the title, the book is about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I've heard the authors speak in a number of videos and recorded lectures too, and something they always stressed during the process of making the book was the necessity to offer a Marxist view of what caused the end of the USSR, not letting conservatives, liberals, social democrats, or any other sort of anti-communist write the history. And what makes the book so strong is that they try their best to look at both the historical context the country found itself in and the way that internal social forces and contradictions caused the end of socialism. Key to the thesis of their book is the exploration of both problems of the economic base and the superstructure. Not going to spend too much time summarizing. We have 6 more books left to talk about. But something I appreciate is that they do try to give various leading figures in the CPSU balanced criticisms and praise, which I think is much more intellectually honest than engaging in one-sided betrayal narratives. Even someone like Khrushchev, who I frankly want to bonk over the head with a petrified cob of corn the more I read about him, deserves a fair assessment. Fun fact, this book has been translated and published in Cuba, and the authors have good reason to believe that a number of cadre in Cuba read the book, and it may have even influenced government policy there, which is honestly the coolest endorsement you can give a book.
True.
I made a YouTube short for this book too, where my comrade read a quote from it, so you can find it on the Weeb Revolution channel. I do want to very quickly read this quote from Domenico Lasordo's essay, Flight from History. This one we will talk about more in part 2, but I just like what he says here. It is clear that when the attainment of communism is put off until an ever more distant and unlikely future, real existing socialism loses its credibility and legitimacy all the more. A party leadership that gradually became more and more self-important, more spoiled and more corrupt, lacked any type of general legitimacy. A time like ours seeks political justification in terms of democracy and people's self-determination. In addition, the tangible consequences of real existing socialism undermined the very reasons for its existence. Ever-present compulsion became more and more unbearable within the civil society that did develop thanks to mass education, the wide extension of culture, and a modicum of social security. With that, let's shift gears to the next book, its follow-ups, and its theme, Capitalism as a Global System.
Today, 150 underdeveloped countries represent 85% of humanity. In this population, there are 800 million undernourished people, 15% of the world's population, and 1.3 billion live in poverty. 1/3 of the world's adult population, 950 million, is illiterate. At the wealthy pole, approximately 40 countries comprising less than 20% of the world's population accumulate 86% of the planet's gross domestic product and account for 82% of all exports. The trends of the world economy do not lead to the development of that poor 85% of humanity, but rather to the deepening of underdevelopment. The idea that developing countries could follow 200 years later the same path of industrialization as today's developed countries is definitely being abandoned, and it becomes evident that the true cause of underdevelopment is, and always was, the continuous extraction of the economic surplus generated by poor nations and its transfer to rich ones. The two poles of development and underdevelopment exist because they produce one relative social peace in the core countries, which export their contradictions. The recipe of neoliberal fundamentalism, deregulation, privatization, free flow of capital and goods, not of people, and the withdrawal of the state in favor of the market, has only aggravated the problem. Agustin Lagedevilla, The Knowledge Economy and Socialism, Science and Society in Cuba.
Capitalism both combines nations and drives them asunder. It knits together peoples of Earth by the railroad, the steamboat, the rapid mail, the newspaper. It creates the material basis for the brotherhood of all nations, but the methods of its expansion brutally thwart that hope. It advances into the backward lands of Earth by plunder and annexation. The civilized people rob the uncivilized ones, and finally war among themselves for the right to rob. Imperialism steadily increases both the economic unity of the earth and the national hates which tear the unity asunder. Anna Louise Strong, This Soviet World.
So, this book we're talking about, or essay, is Discourse on Colonialism, published 1950 by Aimé Césaire. Aimé Césaire was a Black, Martinique-born, anti-colonialist Marxist author, poet, and politician. You may not necessarily know Césaire, but you are likely aware of one of his students, a certain man named Frantz Fanon.
Oh.
Never heard of him.
The fact that Fanon was Césaire's student is actually evident in their writing styles. It's hard to describe, but they wrote in a similar way, and if you read them both, the similarities do become apparent. Césaire was the founder of the Martinique Progressive Party in 1958, and he was a representative in the French National Assembly for many decades, 1945 to 1993, and that's because Martinique, despite being in the East Caribbean Sea, is still considered a part of France.
Vomit.
In fact, Martinique is technically a part of the European Union,
Wild.
despite it being in another hemisphere altogether. So like I said, this recommendation is interesting because this isn't a book, this is an essay, so that also means it's not a very long read. To describe the essay, Discourse on Colonialism is a powerful repudiation of white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism. Césaire strikes at the heart of violent exploitation of Africa, with references to Asia and Latin America, especially with the conflict in Vietnam over its war of independence at the time, but Africa gets the most attention. And when I say he strikes at the heart of colonialist exploitation, he also strikes at all of the ideological defenses of the concept, whether it be vitriolic racial hatred or paternalistic racism. And something that I find really enjoyable about the essay is that, Césaire uses poetic devices here to really powerful effect. Repetition, rhyme, and making very specific syntax choices, like employing a lot of short lines. The structure is not reminiscent of a traditional essay, but the beauty of that, it's combined with a strong historical analysis.
Yeah, I was going to say it's very like, in spite of this being published in the 1950s, it sounds very modern. Like it is written, which is Fanon writes in a similar sort of poetic way, but Fanon's writings are, I guess some of them are in the 50s, but like, it feels like in the 1960s, there was sort of a change toward this type of writing. And Césaire is definitely sort of like a pioneer of that style.
Yeah. And, he cites various quotes from white intellectuals, most of them French, some of them his own colleagues in the French National Assembly, and he uses their extremely racist statements to bolster his attacks against them and what they stand for. A comrade of mine compared Césaire's method of argument to Lenin's, given that both were not strangers to using humor and mocking language against their opponents.
To be fair, Marx did the same thing. Like if you've read the German ideology, he is backslapping all of these like idealist thinkers like constantly.
It's a proud tradition.
Communists been shitposting since ever.
True.
Yeah, but to really get the gist of that, you'd have to actually read the essay yourself. But I do have a short passage from it here because I do want to at least give the listeners a little sample. And since I have been asked to speak about colonialization and civilization, let us go straight to the principal lie that is the source of all the others. Colonization and civilization? In dealing with this subject, the commonest curse is to be the dupe in good faith of a collective hypocrisy that cleverly misrepresents problems, the better to legitimize the hateful solutions provided for them. In other words, the essential thing here is to see clearly, to think clearly, that is, dangerously, and to answer clearly the innocent first question, what fundamentally is colonization? To agree on what it is not, neither evangelization, nor a philanthropic enterprise, nor a desire to push back the frontiers of ignorance, disease, and tyranny, nor a project undertaken for the greater glory of God, nor an attempt to extend the rule of law. To admit once and for all, without flinching at the consequences, that the decisive actors here are the adventurer and the pirate, the wholesale grocer and the ship owner, the gold digger and the merchant, appetite and force, and behind them the baleful projected shadow of a form of civilization which at a certain point in its history finds itself obligated for internal reasons to extend to a world scale the competition of its antagonistic economies. For anyone who's read Lenin's Imperialism, you see what he's talking about right there. And like I said, discourse on colonialism is a starting point. It's a figurative suplex on every intellectually dishonest or racist stereotype thrown at the people whose cultures and societies were annihilated, upended, and exploited by Western imperialism. But it's an essay. It's not going to cover everything. That's why the follow-ups to this book are ones focused more on the political economy of imperialism. And having an anti-imperialist and decolonial grounding is essential. Capitalism is a global system, and Marxism is decolonial. And so we need to learn from authors from the global south. Hence me spotlighting Césaire here, and later Walter Rodney, Eduardo Galeano, and Samir Amin. Really, I'd say the biggest con about the essay is that you're unlikely to recognize every person Césaire makes reference to, but I think there are enough context clues that you can at least figure out who each person is. Plus, given the essay's length, it's perfect for a deeper reread not long after your initial experience with it. Don't just read, comprehend too, please.
Yeah.
I really don't have much else to say about it. It's so short that I can't really muster up any critiques without them being nitpicks. Any last words on it, Jeremy?
Yeah, I would say like read this. Like, there's no reason not to. It's only a few pages long, and it is super spicy, so it keeps your attention pretty well. There's, if you haven't read it, because I had not read this before, it was my assigned reading from Andre. I regret not having read it before because it is so good and it's so dense, very concise. Like, yeah, I think you will enjoy reading this, and you should definitely, even if, whatever, you feel like you have a pretty good grasp on decolonization and the history of colonialism and whatever. And also he makes fun of the French a lot. So that's also good.
We love that.
Yeah,
we love
no,
that here.
check that out. Check that out. It's a really good text.
So, for the first follow-up to this book, we have How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney,
Excellent.
published 1972. This is an amazing book. Right off the bat, it offers a brilliant historical materialist explanation of the concepts of development and underdevelopment. And from there, he goes on to describe, as it says in the title, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. It's stellar for grasping so many points in the history of Africa and Europe. You learn just how essential the slave trade was for the birth of European and North American capitalism, how European trade relations weakened Africa and hindered nation-state development, and how this underdevelopment left it vulnerable to colonization. He does also a really good job of centering technological development in economic growth and just really grabbing the whole social totality. And if that sounds horrible to read, it's not. It's so brilliantly written. I read this in just a couple days. It's so good. And then I reread it because I definitely missed stuff, but great author. Great grasp of the superstructural side. In the final few pages of chapter 3, there is just a brilliant attack on capitalism and how its relationship with racism manifested in a cyclical relationship that affects the superstructure and pushes the advanced capitalist countries to do racist things. It's hard to describe, but Rodney just explains it in a really clear way. I think everyone should read it, especially white people who don't have a good conception of racism. So that's just a quick summary. Of course, I have criticisms. The publishing date is 1972. So further strides that were made in learning the study of African history are things Rodney couldn't talk about in his book. Also, the date. Various revolutionary governments have sadly been toppled by then. Apartheid ended years after this book was written, so Rodney wasn't able to talk about the social economic advancements and also failures of the post-apartheid regime because there are still a lot of problems in that country. And there's a lack of focus of women on this book, which is sad. He does, to his credit, he does talk about them in some sections, but more would have been better. The book is about 300 pages in my copy. And, the scope, it prevents it from being even more, but for what it is, it's brilliant. And our next book for this theme, Capitalism as a Global System, is Open Veins of Latin America, 5 Centuries of the Pillage of a Continent by Eduardo Galeano, published 1971. So this book does a similar thing to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It helps you see the social forces of capitalism at work that make it possible to really comprehend colonialism and imperialism through a historical materialist lens. It's one thing to say that capitalism is built off of blood and genocide. It's another thing entirely to be able to convey that concept. And Galeano does such a good job of that, specifically for Latin America and the Caribbeans. There's a lot I could say here, but we don't have a ton of time. I do like the focus on the environment, the resources extracted, and how that just completely upended and affected the lives of the people who live in Latin America. He talks about coal, sugar, rubber, copper, and how that changed these environments due to colonialism. And as colonialism changed, how capitalism changed, and how things shifted from, say, people being able to produce their own food to shifting to an export oriented economy where things had to be imported and people were going hungry. It's not a great summary, but it's just a very, very good book. Very similar to Rodney's book. And, just read it. Like I said, for the last one, the publishing date is the biggest con. This was written 1971. And you can tell the author was hitting himself for writing it so early because in the foreword, he writes about the Chilean coup d'etat, where Salvador Allende was killed and replaced by Pinochet. And he's not able to talk about the 80s, the lost decades of Latin America. He can't talk about Chavismo. He can't talk about Bolivia. And, that's unfortunate. But for what it is, really good book, good for setting a foundation for further study.
Also, I think it's worth noting that he receives a lot of shit because he's not a historian. He's a journalist and like an activist. And he died, 10 years ago, I think, I want to say.
Yeah.
And before his death, he published a criticism of his previous work. And I think that also gives him some degree of credibility. He was looking back and reflecting on the things that had changed and willing to add things and analyze things in a different way. And I think that even for all of its cons and shortcomings, remains a really trusted source.
Yeah. And also who the fuck cares? What makes somebody a historian? There's no scientific background you have to be a historian. Learning how to research is about the extent of it.
No, that's all of the critiques. It's he's not a real historian. He clearly has biases.
So what?
And I'm okay, because historians never have biases.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Capital H historians. They just write from the pure void.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure,
All
Stephen
right.
Kotkin.
Now we will be shifting to the third theme, the endless Cold War.
In the neo-colonies, those who wish to overthrow the comprador establishment face not only the challenges of organizing their countrymen, but of doing so with none of the vast resources the color revolutionaries enjoy. Often, the most that can be reasonably hoped is that the new comprador rulers that a revolution inevitably inaugurates will be less brutal than the last. There is little fear among Western bourgeoisie that they might fail to gain control of a new uprising, i.e., fail to co-opt and color a revolution, wherever it may appear. After all, where is their competition? By far, the greatest exporter of revolution in the 21st century has not been Venezuela, nor Cuba, nor Russia. It has certainly not been the People's Republic of China, which maintains a careful policy of non-interference in foreign political affairs. Nor is it even the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is the United States of America. Today, wherever and whenever the oppressed rise up in search of justice, the agents of injustice are always there among them, ready to lead them astray. Kyle Farana, Why the World Needs China, Development, Environmentalism, Conflict Resolution, and Common Prosperity, page 57.
Destabilization means hiring agents to tear apart the social and economic fabric of the country. It's a technique for putting pressure on the government, hoping that they can make the government come to the US's terms, or that the government will collapse altogether and they can engineer a coup d'etat, and have the thing wind up with their own choice of people in power. What we're talking about is going in and deliberately creating conditions where the farmer can't get his produce to market, where children can't go to school, where women are terrified inside their homes as well as outside, where government-administered programs grind to a complete halt, where the hospitals are treating wounded people instead of sick people, where international capital is scared away and the country goes bankrupt. Of course, they're attacking a lot more. And of course, the CIA is doing this everywhere around the world, every day. You just don't hear about it on NPR. Douglas Valentine, The CIA as Organized Crime, How Illegal Operations Corrupt America and the World, pages 340 and 341.
So, this theme, The Endless Cold War, will be connected to probably one of my favorite books, Atrocity Fabrication and Its Consequences, How Fake News Shapes World Order, by A.B. Abrams, published 2023. Really quickly, the author Abrams is a UK-based expert on international politics and security with master degrees in both. He knows Chinese, Arabic, and Korean, which means that as a researcher, he can actually consult primary source documents in those languages, which is very important since he writes from a global lens. It's also apparent in the book, since the chapters on the DPRK and People's China are some of the best written and researched parts. Fun fact, the author studied the Korean language at a university in Pyongyang.
Jealous.
Nice.
Very jealous, touched by Juche. So, the author is a consistent critic of Western imperialism throughout all his books, and I've read pretty much all of them, with the exception of like 3. And, he's not a Marxist, but he's not an anti-communist author. And by that I mean he doesn't engage in the sort of anti-communist genuflection you see from left-wing authors who, while critical of capitalism and Western imperialism, still throw in some eye-rolling remarks about socialist regimes. Noam Chomsky is one of them. Chomsky is someone who Abrams cites a few times in this book for his writing on U.S. aggression against Vietnam, because Chomsky is a good critic of Western aggression. William Bloom does a similar thing in his book, Killing Hope, whenever he talks about Stalin or the USSR, which makes certain parts of that book very annoying to read, despite it being a great text. Christian Godsey, who wrote the famous Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism book, along with a really good book, Taking Stock of Shock. She does that sometimes too. Not that those comments delegitimize the works of those authors. I just think for those of us who are easily annoyed by lib talking points, it's something you're going to run into. Remember, you have to read outside your comfort zone. Even if the authors say lib things, suck it up. Please read. Abrams thankfully doesn't do that stuff. In fact, what I love about atrocity fabrication and its consequences is that if you're someone who wants to be a Marxist-Leninist, it gives you so much information to counter anti-communist narratives of history. And it does a good job of framing Western aggression against socialist countries and non-Western aligned states within a historical context. Now, Ray, you read this book at my request? Anything?
I sure did.
Just any general thoughts about the book before I go further?
Yeah, I had read this before I was assigned, but I went and reread upon my receiving my assignment. And I will say that like this was a text that when it was published, I sent to a lot of different people. And I think for that reason, that really a lot of his arguments are like not about these countries or societal projects being positive, but just about Western intervention and media retelling. And that makes it like really accessible for like left curious people, or even like the farther right-wing people in your life who already have a sort of like mistrust for systems. So if this is kind of my endorsement of like maybe who would benefit, because it's really got all the hits, right? We've got Tiananmen Square, we've got 9/11, we've got Gaddafi, we've got Xinjiang, like we've got everything, right? Like it's got something for everyone, whether it's liberals who are, pearl clutching over the injustices that they read about, or it's like far right-wing people who are like, you can't trust the lot of them. This is like really helpful because again, it doesn't uphold what they're trying to do necessarily. It just points out that the West is repeatedly interfering in ways that are otherwise like kind of unfathomable.
Right. And I think one good example of that is chapter 6, the Iraq War chapter, because he does bring up an example of Saddam Hussein gassing Kurds. But he did that when he had U.S. support.
Yes.
So no one in the media cared.
Yeah.
Yeah. And really quick, I would like to define the term psychological war, because people throw out the word psyop so often on the internet, it doesn't even mean anything anymore. Here's a quote from the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's predecessor, where they define psychological war. This quote is pulled from the preface of Human Rights in the Soviet Union by Albert Shamansky. Again, links in the show notes. The coordination and use of all means, including moral and physical, by which the end is to be attained, other than those of recognized military operations, but including the psychological exploitation of the results of those recognized actions, which tend to destroy the will of the enemy to achieve victory and to damage his political or economic capacity to do so, which tend to deprive the enemy of the support, assistance, or sympathy of his allies or associates, or of neutrals, or to prevent his acquisition of such support, assistance, or sympathy, which tend to create, maintain, or increase the will to the victory of our own people and allies to acquire, maintain, or increase the support, assistance, and sympathy of neutrals. So, a bit of a complex one, but you see that psychological warfare is done in an attempt to delegitimize and isolate an enemy so that potential allies or even just neutral parties become hostile to it. It involves creating the conditions that allow an aggressor to choke the enemy's attempt at economic development or maintaining political sovereignty, hence why we opened this theme with a quote from CIA's Organized Crime of what destabilization actually means. I think people throw out that word so often they forget that, hey, actually, a lot of people's lives get hurt by it. It's really horrible. A big part of the psychological war is atrocity propaganda, and this book talks about that. Here's a quick quote from the intro. Atrocity fabrication can transform in the public eyes a war of unprovoked aggression into a war of liberation of the oppressed, or turn a blockade to starve enemy civilians into a humane effort to pressure an abusive government. Claims of atrocity can also serve to delegitimize criticisms of one's action against an adversary, portraying such opposition as siding with injustice and facilitating egregious crimes. So right there, you see.
Are you asking me if I support Hamas? Is that what's happening right now? Do you support Hamas?
Yeah. It's taking like even like well-intended people and asking them, it's like, oh, you support these terrorists, these insurgents.
Yeah.
You're just doing regime apologia. You're
Yeah.
whitewashing. You're
Yeah.
whatever. And again, another quick quote. This one was from page 8 because he defines what a meta narrative is. And this one, definitely take it away, listeners. This is a big one. A meta-narrative is an overarching account or interpretation of events and circumstances that provide a pattern of structure for people's beliefs and gives additional meaning to their experiences, particularly for countries or actors with which consumers of media content have less first-hand contact. Enough sources repeating similar narratives of atrocities or other misconduct can strongly influence what kind of country/actor the target is considered to be. All future encounters with the target will then be interpreted through the context of this overarching narrative. A powerful meta-narrative affects not only the public, but also analysts, journalists, and even policymakers who will be strongly inclined to interpret new information related to the country or actor in the context of the narrative. This gets to the heart of the book, but also not that, also to the conflict between capitalism and socialism. The author stresses that the book covers countries who challenge the Western-led order but who aren't socialist, Iraq, Syria, Libya. But two of the countries that get the most focus are People's China and Democratic Korea, both countries led by communist parties who have been the target of decades and decades of psychological warfare and varying degrees of economic warfare. Chapter 2, I think, is kind of the best chapter of the book, in my opinion. It covers the Korean War and it gets to basically the origin of Cold War propaganda. This was such a pivotal moment because one thing the West did was forcibly repatriate captured Chinese and North Korean prisoners of war to the West by coercing them. And that became a huge media thing that helped the US set the narrative for the Cold War. The author even says if Chinese or North Korean media had the same media access that the West did, the treatment of their prisoners would have been regarded as one of the great atrocities of the 20th century. And it may be a little depressing to realize how powerful the Western propaganda apparatus is, but it's good for us to understand just how profoundly bourgeois narratives of history whitewash the US and the imperialist Western countries. This isn't to say that everything a socialist country has done has been false. It just means that our history creates meta-narratives, so we view those countries with suspicion by default.
Mm-hmm.
And so attempts to address accusations against them is branded as denial of history, apologia, whitewashing, or repetition of state propaganda. Ray, anything else to say about the book? Did you have a specific favorite chapter?
Favorite chapter? I think I'm always going to say the 9/11 chapter is my favorite chapter. Sorry, can't believe I'm laughing. But also similar to what you were saying, sorry, as you were talking, I was just kind of like thinking of the way that my brain works. But the ways in which you are pre-taught, and this is talked about in the book, right? A couple different examples of the way that we are taught to see everything as different, like as Westoids, right? Like we're taught to see everything that's different than what we are familiar with as inherently suspicious or like gross or weird. And so even there were so many examples of just describing something like just neutrally, right? And we just still see it now. Like, I don't know about you guys, but when I watch certain media or I read certain things, it's like like when Hakeem talks about the liberals and the walls, it's like I hear how other people are going to receive this, I don't know, a story shared by somebody from the DPRK, or this like cultural thing that happens in Vietnam or Venezuela or something like that. And because we are taught to see like our culture as non-ideological and pure and correct and liberated, then any other sort of cultural differences just like further add to the scary, weird foreigner. When in reality, like we're just talking about somebody from a different culture. And kind of to the things that you were saying, Andre, at the top of the show, like, I don't know, make a friend, or if you're so just like horrible and you can't make friends, then just like watch a variety of YouTube video essays or something. So that you can kind of like learn things about, no, but it's true, right? We're you heard it here first, folks. We've been talking about maybe doing some kind of like watch party about a documentary shot in the DPRK. And there's so many things, because I lived in the bad Korea for a few years, that I can see from watching it that like seems strange to an outsider, like cultural things. But somebody who lived in the bad Korea, I'm like, no, this is just like Korean culture, like broad East Asian culture in a lot of instances. But because so many people in the West do not have any experience of this whatsoever, I know that most people will watch it and just be like, ooh, so scared. Ooh, so weird. Why is it like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and just very touching very quickly on specifically chapter 7, I think. Abrams talks about the modern North Korean and American conflict, and he basically just completely like destroys and debunks all of those, North Korean dissidents who go on like South Korean talk shows and like
Yeonmi Park.
cry.
Yes.
Oh, he destroys her. He goes into the no, he goes in, he does. He destroys. He goes into the people who fund her, who back her, and he talks to like North Korean defectors who talk about how like actually these people going on those shows, they're exaggerating for views. But all of that actually feeds into our perceptions of the DPRK. So we think of it as a weird place. There is an active effort to shape people's perceptions of that.
And it relies on existing hierarchies of culture and race, right? Like when you see the way that a lot of people in the DPRK live, I mean, it's very clear to me as somebody who works and lives alongside a lot of indigenous people that like they're indigenous people with ecological, like, yes, they're forced into poverty by the colonial, like the global colonial order, but also they're indigenous people who have a specific relationship to their land and therefore they want to care for it, and a specific relationship to one another, and therefore they want to care for one another. And so as a Westerner who has been flattened into this identity of consumer and everything about your life is what you can buy or sell to prove you are who you say you are, you look at this and you're like, ew, their lives are so poor and sad and weird and gross.
Yeah.
And somebody like Yeonmi Park comes out with like all of the trappings of Western culture, and we're like, wow, look at her, she got away, right?
Oh my God, her. Did you see, this is a tangent. Did you see that?
Whatever it is, yes. I can't stop watching anything she does.
It was a tweet. It was an image, and it was like 2 glasses of water. No, actually 3. One label said glass half empty, one said glass half full, one glass half racist, and she was like, OMG leftists, everything is racist. Just
okay.
just weird libertarian lady now too. Just hate her.
Incredible analysis. Thank you, Yeonmi, for your contribution.
She's married to a weird white man now, and it's really uncomfortable. The whole relationship is deeply uncomfortable.
Oh God, yeah. Well, one of the Tiananmen student veterans, they married the former chairman of the Massachusetts Republican Party, and it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That does make sense. Yeah. So again, this is Atrocity, Fabrication, and Its Consequences: How Fake News Shapes World Order. Links in the show notes. Just content warning for this book, folks. It's very heavy. When you read it, it feels like throwing cold water on yourself just because of how much violence he describes. Not in a like purposely shocking way, just recounting the facts. It can be really depressing. So self-care when you read it.
And so many different like kinds and layers of violence. I mean, obviously a lot of it is like actual physical violence and repercussions, but then you just like have to sit back and be like, oh no, it's just evil. Like they thought of the evilest way to like write a news article or do an interview. Like it is like the depth of evil, like evil in its totality almost like eclipses the individual instances of violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So for the follow-ups to this book, and again, the theme is the endless Cold War, we have The Liberal Virus, Permanent War and the Americanization of the World by Samir Amin, published 2004. Samir Amin was an Egyptian Marxist and a brilliant economist and author. The viewers may not necessarily know his name, but you you absolutely are familiar with a term that he coined, Eurocentrism. If you say that term, thank Samir Amin.
Thanks, Samir. We love you.
Thank you. My goat. So The Liberal Virus is an interesting book because it was written in 2004. And, this is George W. Bush, invasion of Iraq. He even talks about that in a later chapter on Europe, where he's like insulting Tony Blair as being a legitimizer of the invasion. Of course, we hate Tony Blair, enemy of the pod. In those aspects, it's an interesting insight to the era, but part of it may feel a bit dated. But the parts of the liberal virus that I find valuable are where he criticizes the neoliberal world order, and specifically neoliberal economics and political thought. Chapter 2 is my favorite for this, the way he attacks pure economics and postmodernism using a Marxist lens. Amin demonstrates that Marx understood capitalism better than the people who defend and upload the system. Time and again, you hear these right-wingers talk about capitalism and you realize, hey, actually, they don't understand it at all.
Mm-hmm.
We know it better than them, and they want to defend it.
Yeah.
For that reason, I would actually call this book the Anti-Neoliberal Manifesto. It's a good read for people who need to untangle themselves from bourgeois conceptions of society, the economy, and politics. Just a warning on the writing. It was translated from French to English. I don't know if that had an effect on the comprehensibility or if maybe Samir Amin is just a dense writer, but when you read it, it is a little more challenging than some of the other texts we've talked about today. Part of that is related to an actual criticism I have. The man abuses the parentheses way too much. Like sometimes there's a paragraph and it will have like 3 layered thoughts going at once. Sometimes it is just really rich and dense.
So he's using the brackets as well, like not just the parentheses.
Stop with the parentheses, please. Just make this longer. You don't have to do this. And for the other book, we have Power and Primacy, A History of Western Intervention in the Asian Pacific, 2023 updated edition. This one also by Avery Abrams. This book is on the author's strongest subject, East Asia. It's a historical tour de force of how the West has intervened in the region, but it has a particular focus on the Cold War and post-Cold War eras. I found it good to include this book here because it means that of the 9 books we've been talking about this episode, at least one has a central focus on Africa, one on Latin America, and one on Asia, although East Asia in the case of Abrams' book anyway. Personal highlights: the chapters of Japan during World War II, including a discussion on the criminal atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that I think people in the West really need to internalize. There's an excellent chapter on the attempt by the West to destroy People's China, including some history of Tibet and Western sponsorship of Tibetan insurgents, who were trained in Colorado. You want to explain that, Jeremy?
It's definitely my fault. I take personal responsibility for the training of Tibetan insurgents in Colorado.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there's some history on the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, and really a rather heart-wrenching parts about how awful the financial crisis was in South Korea specifically. It's horrible. It really strikes at the reason why occupied Korea has such a high suicide rate. It's horrible. The big thing I don't like about the book is that it's kind of the lack of focus on the countries Imperial Japan invaded. I know the focus is on the Western interventions, but I don't know. I think he could have talked a little more about like Nanking or other parts of Asia that Japan invaded. I don't know. It's certainly not apologia. He never does apologia for Imperial Japan, but I think it's kind of a failure to really educate people on what Japan did, especially since it's going to be a US American audience reading this book.
The literal decades of occupation of Korea by Japan.
Yeah. It's not a deal killer. He doesn't do anything like intentionally offensive. I just think it's a place he should have focused more on. Right, and that's that for all 9 of the books.
For part 1.
For part 1, yes. Part 2 coming whenever. I don't know when these episodes come out.
Yeah, we always like shuffle the order anyway, so it's complicated.
Could be any time.
Just to recap really quickly for the audience, we talked about The Soviet World by Anna Louise Strong, The Russians Are Coming by V.L. Allen, Socialism Betrayed by Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny. We talked about Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire. Again, that one's an essay, not a book, but, related. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. Atrocity, Fabrication, and Consequences by A.B. Abrams. The Liberal Virus by Samir Amin. And Power and Primacy, also by A.B. Abrams. Any last comments, guys?
Read, learn a language, make a friend.
Read a book, liberal.
Read a book. Go to the show notes. For the love of God, please. There are so many direct links to some of the texts.
And hey, get friends. I know that I'm usually the one that narrates a lot of our theory episodes. And sometimes we get really good and interesting and generative comments from the episodes of people who interpreted something differently than I did. And that is the limitation of episodes like this or discussions like this. And the best way, this is not a substitute, right? The best way to learn theory is to engage with it with comrades, not by yourself. So please get a friend. If you don't have a friend, maybe go to our Patreon and ask if somebody will be your friend. I'm sure they'll say yes.
Legit though, we, I don't know. You cannot be an island. You cannot exist only online. It's not a thing that really works as far as developing a real human being. We have to be out in the streets talking to people, and we have to make friends to do that.
Yep. Knowledge is social, and you have to connect theory with practice.
Fuck around, find out.
If you are just sitting at home reading, you are making Marx very, very sad. He'll be so sad, he'll probably go drink a little.
Dang.
Engels his money, but,
At the Red Dragon pub in Manchester.
If you want to be our Engels, go to patreon.com/ProlsPod.
And come back for part 2, where we will talk about properly reading theory as well as more studying habit tips and advice.
Very cool. Well, that about does it for this episode. Thank you so much to Andre and to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are, this is the smallest we've ever had. The newest ones are Devin J, Andrew, and Buh. And a very special shout out to our Vanguard patrons, Class Antagonism, Audie Gem, The Leninist Lawyer, B, Lil Lumpenprol, The Winking Cossack, Better Read Than Liberal, and Alex D. Once again, if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/ProlsPod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolspod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, all that algorithm stuff, and we will see you in 2 weeks. May the Spectre haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Death to America.
Death to America.
Also France.
And friends.
Just Europe in general, I think.
They envision the entire world Sovietized communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style.
Stalin.
Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro. Soviet retro. Communist style. Communist style. Soviet retro. Soviet retro,